There are moments when the world holds its breath, suspended between what was and what will never again be the same. On the blood-soaked fields of Thornhaven, beneath a sky choked with smoke and the cries of the dying, such a moment crystallized around a single figure who should not have existed yet refused to fall. Ilara Nightwind stood alone among carnage that spoke of battles fought by armies, not individuals. Around her lay the twisted remains of Shadowspawn, creatures of nightmare that had poured from the cursed lands beyond the Veil, their black blood steaming against autumn earth that had been peaceful meadow mere hours before. Her sword, though nicked and stained, remained steady in hands that trembled only with exhaustion, not fear. She had been left for dead by those she trusted, abandoned when the retreat horn sounded, and survival demanded choosing between the wounded and the living. They had made their choice with the cold calculation that war demanded, writing her off as acceptable loss in conflicts where individual lives mattered less than strategic advantage. But death had apparently found her an unsatisfactory prize. Where others had fallen to claws and fangs that could shred armor like parchment, Ilara had endured. Where blessed steel had shattered against hide-thick as castle walls, her blade had found its mark with precision that defied understanding. Where trained warriors had been overwhelmed by numbers that blotted out the sun, she had carved space for breath and thought with movements that flowed like water over stone. What the approaching Lycan war host would witness defied every law they understood about human limitation and supernatural endurance. They would see someone who fought as if she carried the strength of 10 while bearing wounds that should have felled a giant. They would watch power manifest through techniques that belonged to their world, not hers, executed with mastery that spoke of bloodlines they thought extinct. Most unsettling of all, they would recognize in her something that called to instincts buried deeper than conscious thought, something that made their wolves pace restlessly, and their king's certainty about the natural order of things begin to crack like ice in spring sun. The battle for Thornhaven was ending, but the questions it raised were just beginning. And at the center of every impossible answer stood a woman who should have died with the rest of the forgotten, yet who breathed still with defiance that refused to acknowledge defeat. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The morning had begun with such promise. Sunlight painted the valleys surrounding Thornhaven in shades of gold and amber, while autumn winds carried the scent of harvest festivals and winter preparations that marked the peaceful rhythm of human settlements, far from the chaos that plagued border territories. The garrison had been expecting routine patrol reports, trade discussions, and the comfortable mundanity of duty assignments that kept soldiers occupied without demanding the blood price that warfare exacted. Instead, they had received reports of Shadowspawn massing beyond the Veil in numbers not seen since the War of Broken Crowns 20 years past. The creatures that haunted the cursed lands were spilling across ancient boundaries with purpose that suggested coordination rather than random hunger, targeting settlements with strategic value rather than simply feeding on whatever human prey they encountered first. Ilara had been among the advance scouts sent to assess the threat and establish defensive positions that might slow the advancing horde until reinforcements could arrive from neighboring garrisons. It was dangerous duty that few volunteers accepted willingly, but it was also opportunity for someone whose questionable background and lack of family connections made advancement through normal channels virtually impossible. She remembered the weight of suspicious glances as they prepared to depart, the carefully neutral expressions that concealed doubts about her readiness for combat that might determine whether anyone returned alive. Captain Marcus had been blunt about his reservations regarding her inclusion in the scouting party. "Nightwind, you've shown competence during training exercises and patrol duties," he had said with diplomatic precision that masked obvious skepticism. "But facing Shadowspawn isn't comparable to anything you've encountered previously. These creatures require experience and teamwork that can't be developed through practice scenarios." "Understood, Captain," she had replied with steady voice that betrayed none of the uncertainty churning beneath her composed exterior. "I won't be a liability to the mission. See that you're not. The men you'll be serving alongside have families depending on their survival. Any mistakes you make won't just cost your own life." The warning had been fair and necessary, though it stung with implications about her expendability compared to soldiers whose connections provided them with value beyond their individual capabilities. Ilara had learned to accept such assessments with grace born from years of proving herself repeatedly to people who forgot her competence as soon as the immediate crisis passed. But now, 6 hours after the scouting party had been overrun by numbers that had rendered tactical planning irrelevant, such concerns seemed laughably naive. The experienced soldiers who were supposed to protect her had fled when survival demanded abandoning wounded comrades. Their training focused more on strategic retreat than last stands against impossible odds. Alara remained not through heroic choice, but through practical necessity. Her injuries had prevented her from matching their pace during the retreat, leaving her to face alone creatures that had scattered veteran warriors like leaves before winter wind. The irony might have been amusing if she had possessed energy for such considerations. Instead, she focused on immediate problems that required solutions more urgently than they required analysis. The shadow spawn circling her position moved with patience that suggested intelligence rather than animal hunger. They had learned from earlier attacks that direct assault on her position resulted in unexpected casualties, so they now probed for weaknesses with coordinated movements that spoke of tactical thinking few humans credited them with possessing. Their forms defied easy description, shifting between states that seemed solid and shadow, muscle and nightmare given substance through malice that had festered beyond the veil for generations. Some resembled wolves grown to impossible size with fangs that dripped acid capable of dissolving steel. Others moved on too many legs with claws that could rend stone, their eyes burning with intelligence that made their bestial forms more rather than less terrifying. What they all shared was hunger for violence that went beyond mere feeding, desire to destroy and corrupt that had driven them across boundaries maintained through ancient magic and newer desperation. They killed not just to survive, but to spread the taint that had consumed the lands beyond the veil, transforming everything they touched into extensions of their cursed realm. Alara wiped blood from her eyes, her own, mixed with that of creatures whose anatomy included fluids that burned like liquid fire, and assessed her tactical situation with clarity that surprised her, despite hours of combat that should have dulled rational thought. She held defensive position among fallen stones that had once been a shepherd's shelter, their arrangement providing some protection from coordinated attacks, while limiting her mobility in ways that would become problematic if her enemies managed to breach her perimeter. Her sword remained functional despite damage that would have rendered lesser blades useless, though she couldn't explain why steel that should have shattered continued to hold edges sharp enough to penetrate hide that had turned aside blessed weapons. More troubling were her injuries, which should have killed her hours ago, yet somehow continued to allow movement and thought despite blood loss that would have felled trained soldiers. Something was sustaining her beyond normal human endurance, lending strength that had no source she could identify, and healing that operated according to principles she didn't understand. The largest of the circling shadow spawn, a creature whose form suggested bear, crossed with something that had never walked under natural sun, rose onto hind legs and released a roar that shook stones beneath her feet. It was signal rather than threat, communication with others of its kind that suggested the patience phase of their assault was ending. "Come on, then," Alara whispered to creatures that probably couldn't understand human speech, but might recognize defiance in any language. "Let's finish this." She raised her sword with movements that should have been impossible given the wounds marking her arms and shoulders, finding strength in reserves that shouldn't have existed, yet somehow continued to respond when survival demanded their use. The first wave came from 3 directions simultaneously. Coordination that would have been impressive if displayed by human soldiers, terrifying when executed by creatures whose existence violated natural law. Alara met them with techniques she had never been formally taught, movements that flowed from instincts buried deeper than conscious memory, yet surfaced now with precision that saved her life repeatedly. Her blade traced patterns through air that seemed to leave trails of light, cutting through shadow substance that reformed around ordinary weapons, but parted before her strike like water before the prow of a ship. She moved with speed that matched their supernatural swiftness, turning their coordination against them by positioning herself where their attacks interfered with each other rather than supporting cooperative assault. But even as she fought with capabilities that defied explanation, Alara recognized that attrition was working against her. Each exchange left her slightly slower. Each wound sapped strength that her mysterious reserves couldn't replace indefinitely. The shadow spawn learned from each encounter, adapting their tactics to account for abilities that shouldn't exist, but clearly functioned according to principles they could observe and counter. She had perhaps minutes before exhaustion or accumulated damage rendered her unable to continue the defense that had somehow sustained her through impossible odds, yet she felt no fear at the prospect of finally falling. only quiet satisfaction that she had lasted longer than anyone, including herself, had thought possible. The end, when it came, would at least come with honor intact and enemies fallen around her who would never threaten the innocent again. But as she prepared for what seemed certain to be the final exchange of her improbable survival, new sounds reached her through the din of combat. Horn calls that spoke of approaching forces, ground vibrations that suggested cavalry moving at speed, and beneath it all a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her bones with recognition she couldn't place. The Shadow Spawn heard it too, their coordinated assault faltering as attention shifted toward whatever approached through the smoke haze distance. Their reaction suggested not just awareness, but something approaching concern, as if whatever was coming represented threat they hadn't anticipated and weren't prepared to face. Elara lowered her sword slightly, using the respite to catch her breath while studying the creatures whose behavior had shifted from coordinated attack to defensive positioning. They were afraid, she realized with shock. These nightmare beings that had scattered trained armies were displaying what could only be interpreted as fear. Through the shifting smoke came shapes that resolved into riders whose mounts moved with fluid grace that spoke of supernatural breeding and training. But it was their riders that made the Shadow Spawn retreat toward better defensive positions, abandoning their assault on her position in favor of preparing for confrontation with enemies they apparently considered far more dangerous. The banner that became visible through the clearing air bore symbols that every human in the Northern Territories learned to recognize in childhood: the crescent moon and crossed claws of House Blackmane, royal sigil of the Lycan kingdom whose armies had never been defeated in open battle, whose king was whispered to be more wolf than man when battle fever claimed him. King Ragnar Blackmane rode at the head of his war host with presence that seemed to bend reality around his passage, mounted on a beast that was clearly more than horse yet not quite wolf, its eyes burning with intelligence that matched its rider's reputation for tactical brilliance combined with savage effectiveness. Behind him came riders whose reputation preceded them across battlefields, where their intervention had turned hopeless defeats into legendary victories. The Lycan military didn't fight according to human understanding of warfare. They brought supernatural speed, strength, and coordination that made them living weapons capable of achievements that defied conventional tactical analysis. But what made Elara's breath catch wasn't their fearsome reputation or obviously supernatural capabilities. It was the way the approaching war host's attention focused immediately on her position, not with the dismissive glance that human forces typically spared for individual soldiers, but with concentration that suggested recognition of something significant. King Ragnar's gaze met hers across the blood-soaked field with intensity that felt almost physical, his expression cycling through surprise, assessment, and something that might have been understanding. Behind him, his captains showed similar attention to her solitary defense, their postures suggesting they were witnessing something that challenged their expectations about human limitations. The Shadow Spawn, recognizing that their tactical situation had deteriorated beyond recovery, began withdrawing toward the Vale with coordination that spoke of strategic thinking rather than panicked flight. They had apparently decided that whatever they had hoped to accomplish at Thornhaven was less important than avoiding confrontation with forces that could threaten their existence. But their withdrawal was interrupted by voice that carried clearly across the battlefield, despite being pitched conversationally rather than shouted. "Stand fast," King Ragnar said, and though Elara couldn't understand how his words reached her over distance and ambient noise, their meaning was unmistakable. "We would see how this ends." The command wasn't directed at his own forces, who remained positioned but inactive, clearly awaiting further orders. It was directed at the Shadow Spawn, who found themselves unable to complete their retreat despite obviously wanting to escape what they now recognized as dangerous situation, and it was directed at her, Elara realized with shock, that sent ice through her exhausted frame. The Lycan King wanted to observe her continued battle against creatures she had been fighting alone for hours, using capabilities that she couldn't explain and apparently shouldn't possess. He wanted to see what she truly was. The weight of supernatural attention pressed against Elara's consciousness like a physical force, though she couldn't spare mental energy to analyze why the Lycan King's scrutiny felt so intensely personal. The Shadow Spawn, finding their retreat blocked by royal command they couldn't disobey, turned back toward her position with renewed aggression that carried undertones of desperation. But something fundamental had changed in the dynamics of combat. Where before the creatures had attacked with tactical patience designed to wear down her defenses through attrition, They now threw themselves forward with reckless fury that spoke of beings forced into confrontation they had hoped to avoid. Their movements carried the frantic energy of animals trapped by predators, fighting not for victory but for the slim chance of survival through overwhelming offense. Alara met their desperate charge with techniques that seemed to flow from muscle memory she had never consciously acquired, her blade moving in patterns that created defensive screens while simultaneously opening offensive opportunities. But the most startling change wasn't in her fighting style. It was in the way her mysterious reserves of strength responded to the presence of watching Lycans. Power that had been slowly depleting throughout hours of impossible combat suddenly surged through her frame with intensity that left her gasping. Her wounds, which had been slowly draining her capacity for continued resistance, began healing with speed that she could actually observe. Most unnervingly, her sword began emanating light that cut through shadow substance with effectiveness that turned desperate defense into aggressive offense. The first shadow spawn to reach her position died so quickly that its packmates had no opportunity to learn from its destruction. Ilara's blade traced a perfect arc that severed the creature's head cleanly, the strike continuing into a spinning movement that opened the throat of a second attacker before it could adjust to her increased speed. But it was the third exchange that demonstrated capabilities which made the watching Lycan army shift restlessly in their saddles. As a massive creature with too many joints and claws like sword blades lunged toward her unprotected back, Alara somehow sensed its approach without turning, dropping into a crouch that allowed the beast to pass overhead while her blade opened its belly from sternum to pelvis. The impossible awareness of attacks from outside her field of vision continued as more creatures pressed their assault. She moved like someone who could see in all directions simultaneously, responding to threats that hadn't yet materialized while positioning herself to take advantage of weaknesses in her enemy's coordination that shouldn't have been apparent to human perception. King Ragnar leaned forward in his saddle, his expression intense as he observed combat techniques that belonged to his people rather than hers. Behind him, Alara could hear low conversations in the growling language that Lycans used among themselves, though she couldn't understand their words. The tone suggested profound confusion, mixed with something approaching awe. "Captain Fenris," the king said in accented human speech that carried clearly despite the distance and ambient noise of combat, "what are your observations regarding the techniques being displayed?" "Sire, she fights with awareness patterns consistent with pack hunting, though she clearly lacks formal training in our combat methods," came the reply in a voice rough with barely contained transformation. "Her blade work incorporates movement forms that suggest bloodline memory, but that should be impossible given her obvious human heritage." "And the power manifesting through her weapon?" "Unknown, Your Majesty. The light emanating from her blade resembles blessed steel enhanced through royal bloodline activation, but such enhancement requires proximity to acknowledged pack leadership and formal recognition of the wielder's right to draw upon pack strength reserves." Alara processed this conversation while simultaneously cutting down 2 more shadow spawn with strikes that seemed to anticipate their movements before they committed to specific attacks. The information suggested that her inexplicable capabilities were being recognized as supernatural in nature, connected somehow to Lycan pack dynamics, despite her human birth and lack of any known connection to their people. But understanding had to wait, as the surviving shadow spawn, recognizing that individual attacks were failing catastrophically, began coordinate a mass assault designed to overwhelm her position through sheer numbers. Nearly a dozen creatures arranged themselves for simultaneous attack from multiple angles, their coordination perfect despite the obvious fear driving their actions. This was the moment Alara had been dreading throughout the long battle, the point where even supernatural reserves and impossible fighting skills would prove insufficient against enemies who could attack faster than she could respond, regardless of how effectively she wielded her mysteriously enhanced blade. But as the creatures prepared to launch their final coordinated assault, something unprecedented occurred. The power that had been flowing through her throughout the battle suddenly intensified beyond anything she had previously experienced, accompanied by awareness that extended far beyond her immediate surroundings to encompass the entire battlefield and everyone present upon it. She could sense the Lycan war host as clearly as if they were part of her own body, feel their emotional states and tactical assessments, understand their supernatural nature in ways that bypassed intellectual analysis in favor of instinctive recognition. More disturbing still, she could sense their response to her: confusion, recognition, and growing certainty that her presence represented something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between human and Lycan nature. King Ragnar himself was the strongest presence in her expanded awareness, his attention focused on her with intensity that felt almost intimate, despite their complete lack of previous interaction. Through their strange connection, she sensed his shock at recognizing capabilities that shouldn't exist, mixed with protective instincts that he clearly didn't understand but couldn't ignore. "Impossible," she heard him murmur, though whether he spoke aloud or she was somehow experiencing his thoughts directly, she couldn't determine. The bloodline has been extinct for 2 centuries, but analysis of impossible revelations would have to wait as the Shadow Spawn launched their coordinated assault with desperation that made their previous attacks seem restrained by comparison. 12 creatures moved as one, their approach timed to arrive simultaneously from angles that should have made defense impossible, regardless of superhuman capabilities. Ilara met their charge with response that transcended anything she had displayed previously. Instead of defending her position, she flowed forward into their attack, her blade moving so quickly that it seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. But more than speed, her movements demonstrated awareness that allowed her to exploit gaps in their coordination that existed for fractions of seconds, turning their numbers against them by forcing them into positions where they interfered with each other's attacks. The exchange lasted perhaps 10 seconds, though to observers it seemed to stretch much longer as supernatural speed compressed action into moments that human perception struggled to follow. When the combat ended, all 12 Shadow Spawn lay dead around Alara's position, their bodies arranged in a rough circle that spoke of destruction so swift and efficient that none had opportunity to adjust their tactics or warn their packmates. But the most startling aspect of the exchange hadn't been its speed or lethality. It had been the way Alara's awareness had expanded to include tactical input from the watching Lycans. Throughout the brief but intense combat, she had somehow drawn upon their collective experience and supernatural senses, incorporating their knowledge into her own fighting techniques without conscious effort or deliberate intent. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of Shadow Spawn retreating toward the veil and the heavy breathing of mounts whose supernatural nature made them sensitive to displays of power that challenged their understanding of natural law. King Ragnar dismounted with fluid grace that spoke of centuries of practice, his approach toward Alara's position careful but determined. Behind him, his captains showed similar attention to her situation, though they maintained respectful distance that suggested they recognized this was conversation between individuals whose status transcended military hierarchy. "Lady," the king said when he reached speaking distance, his voice carrying formal courtesy that nonetheless couldn't disguise obvious confusion about how to classify someone whose existence defied easy categorization. "I am Ragnar Blackmane, king of the Northern Lycans. Your display of martial prowess has been illuminating." Alara straightened with effort that revealed just how much the extended battle had cost her, despite supernatural reserves that had sustained her through impossible odds. Her sword, though still glowing faintly with power that defied explanation, trembled slightly in hands that were finally beginning to acknowledge exhaustion that had been held at bay through adrenaline and mysterious strength. "Your Majesty," she replied with courtesy that seemed inadequate given the circumstances, but represented the best her depleted condition could manage. "I am Alara Nightwind, scout of the Thornhaven garrison. I thank you for your intervention, though I fear it may have been unnecessary." "Unnecessary?" King Ragnar's expression shifted to something between amusement and incredulity. "Lady Nightwind, you have just demonstrated combat capabilities that would challenge seasoned members of my royal guard, using techniques that belong to bloodlines my people believed extinct for over 2 centuries. Nothing about this situation could be characterized as unnecessary." The revelation sent ice through Alara's frame as implications began to penetrate exhaustion that had been dulling her analytical thinking. If her fighting techniques belonged to bloodlines connected to the Lycan royal family, that suggested hereditary connections she had never suspected and couldn't explain through any family history she had been taught. "Your Majesty, I fear there's been some misunderstanding. I'm human-born, trained in conventional weapons techniques by instructors who served in the regular army. Whatever capabilities you observed must represent unusual circumstances rather than supernatural heritage." "Captain Fenris," King Ragnar said without taking his attention from her face, "would you share your assessment of the combat techniques we just witnessed?" "Sire, the movement patterns displayed were consistent with Moonshadow combat forms. specifically those developed by House Silvermane for use against creatures immune to conventional weapons, came the reply in the rough voice Alara had heard earlier. The awareness patterns demonstrated pack sense integration at levels that require both bloodline heritage and formal training that can only be provided by acknowledged pack leaders. And House Silvermane? Extinct since the War of Broken Crowns, when the last known member died defending the sacred groves against Shadow Spawn incursion. No survivors were recorded, and their bloodline was declared ended with full honors. The information struck Alara like physical blow, suggesting connections to people and events that contradicted everything she had been taught about her family background. According to her understanding, her parents had been common soldiers who died in border skirmishes when she was too young to retain clear memories, leaving her to be raised by distant relatives who had provided basic care without sharing detailed family history. But if Captain Fenris's assessment was accurate, her instinctive fighting techniques suggested heritage from noble house, whose bloodline should have ended 2 decades before her birth. The timing made direct descent impossible, yet the evidence of supernatural capabilities seemed undeniable. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, struggling to process implications that challenged fundamental assumptions about her identity and origins. "I have no knowledge of any connection to House Silvermane, or indeed to any family of supernatural heritage. My guardians led me to believe my parents were ordinary soldiers without notable bloodline connections." "Your guardians," King Ragnar repeated with tone that suggested the word carried particular significance. "Were these guardians related to your parents by blood or marriage?" "No, Your Majesty. They were friends of the family who accepted responsibility for my care after my parents' deaths. They provided adequate upbringing, but didn't discuss my family history in detail, claiming such conversations would be too painful given the circumstances of my loss." "I see." The king's expression grew thoughtful, as he considered information that clearly held meaning she wasn't yet prepared to understand. "And these guardians, where might they be found now?" "Dead, Your Majesty. They died in a plague that swept through the eastern provinces 3 years past, taking many who lacked access to healers trained in dealing with supernatural diseases." "How convenient," came a new voice, though the speaker's tone suggested anything but approval of the timing. Captain Fenris had approached close enough to participate directly in the conversation, his appearance confirming Alara's suspicion that Lycans in their human forms retained enough supernatural characteristics to be unmistakably non-human, despite their basic similarity to mortal anatomy. "You believe the timing suspicious?" King Ragnar asked his captain with tone that suggested he was seeking confirmation of conclusions he had already reached. "Sire, the sequence of events shows patterns consistent with deliberate concealment of bloodline heritage. Child separated from family during crisis. Raised by non-relatives who discourage investigation of family background. Guardians die under circumstances that prevent later questioning about information they may have possessed." "And the conclusion you draw from these patterns?" "That Lady Nightwind's heritage was deliberately concealed from her, most likely to protect her from political complications that acknowledgement of her bloodline connections would have created. House Silvermane's extinction was politically convenient for several noble families whose territorial claims would have been challenged by surviving heirs. Discovering that the bloodline continued through hidden descendants would create difficulties." Alara listened to this analysis with growing horror, as she realized that her entire understanding of her background and identity might be built upon deceptions designed to protect political interests rather than her personal well-being. If her true heritage connected her to noble house with territorial claims and supernatural capabilities, then the humble upbringing that had shaped her entire worldview represented deliberate suppression of information that belonged to her by right. "Your Majesty," she said, with voice that struggled to remain steady despite the emotional chaos threatening to overwhelm rational thought, "if what your captain suggests is accurate, then I have been living my entire life based on lies designed to benefit people whose names I don't even know. The implications, I'm not prepared to process such possibilities." "Understandable," King Ragnar replied, with gentleness that seemed incongruous, coming from someone whose reputation emphasized savage effectiveness in combat. Discovery that one's life has been built upon deceptions designed to benefit others' political convenience would be overwhelming under the best circumstances. But Lady Nightwind, the immediate concern isn't processing emotional implications of possible heritage revelations. "What is the immediate concern, Your Majesty?" "The immediate concern is that you have just demonstrated capabilities that mark you as either the most dangerous human alive or the last surviving member of bloodline whose existence would challenge several territorial settlements that have been considered stable for 20 years. Either possibility makes you extremely valuable to some parties and extremely dangerous to others. Oh, the king's blunt assessment sent new chills through her exhausted frame as she began to understand that her mysterious fighting abilities, whatever their source, had transformed her from anonymous garrison scout into someone whose very existence posed political threats that powerful people would kill to eliminate. And your counsel regarding how I should respond to such circumstances? My counsel is that you accept my protection while we investigate the truth about your heritage and determine what political complications your continued existence might create for various noble families whose territorial claims assumed House Silvermane's permanent extinction. The offer represented safety, but also acknowledgement that her previous life as anonymous soldier was ending regardless of what investigation might reveal about her true background. Whether she proved to be human with unusual talents, or Lycan nobility with hidden heritage, returning to garrison duty in comfortable obscurity was no longer possible. But before she could formulate response to such momentous offer, their conversation was interrupted by commotion from the Lycan war host that suggested new developments requiring immediate attention. "Sire," called a voice from among the mounted warriors. Scouts report additional Shadowspawn forces massing beyond the Veil, in numbers that suggest coordinated assault rather than random incursion. The creatures we just witnessed were apparently advanced scouts for much larger force. King Ragnar's attention immediately shifted toward tactical considerations that took precedence over personal conversations, though his protective positioning near Alara suggested she remained priority even while military concerns demanded focus. Assessment of threat levels? Unknown, Your Majesty, but scout reports suggest numbers sufficient to threaten multiple settlements simultaneously, rather than concentrating on single target. If accurate, we're facing invasion rather than raid. Mobilization timeline for full defensive response? Assuming immediate departure, we can have reinforcements moving toward threatened settlements within hours. But coordination with human forces will be necessary to ensure effective coverage of territory too large for our numbers to defend comprehensively. The military discussion continued around Alara, while she struggled to process revelations that had transformed her understanding of her own identity within the span of minutes. But her analytical thinking was interrupted by realization that the approaching crisis represented immediate threat to her life, regardless of political complications that might emerge from heritage investigation. If Shadowspawn forces were massing for coordinated assault on human settlements, then Thornhaven's garrison would be expected to participate in defensive efforts despite their recent casualties. As scout who had survived encounter with advance forces, she would be valuable for intelligence regarding enemy capabilities and tactics. But returning to human military service while possessing capabilities that suggested supernatural heritage would create exactly the type of exposure that King Ragnar had warned might prove dangerous. Her fighting abilities would be noted and reported, potentially reaching attention of people who had invested in keeping House Silvermane's bloodline buried permanently. "Your Majesty," she said quietly during lull in military planning discussions, "if I remain with human forces during the coming crisis, my capabilities will become widely known, potentially creating the political complications you mentioned. But if I don't return to my unit, I'll be declared a deserter and hunted as such." "Both concerns are valid," King Ragnar agreed, with tone that suggested he had been considering similar problems while managing immediate military priorities. "But there may be a solution that addresses practical requirements while protecting your interests until we can investigate your heritage properly." "What solution, Your Majesty?" "You could accept temporary commission in Lycan military service as specialist consultant regarding Shadowspawn tactics and capabilities. Such arrangement would provide legitimate reason for your absence from human forces, while placing you under my direct protection during investigation of your background." The offer represented escape from immediate problems, while potentially creating new complications that Alara wasn't equipped to evaluate. Accepting commission in Lycan military service would mark her as collaborator in the eyes of some human officials, while declining might leave her exposed to political dangers she couldn't yet identify or counter. "Your Majesty, I'm honored by such offer, but I'm not certain I'm qualified to serve as specialist consultant regarding enemies I only encountered for the first time this morning." "Lady Nightwind," King Ragnar said with slight smile that suggested amusement at her modest assessment of recent accomplishments. "You have just survived solo combat against Shadowspawn forces that scattered experienced human soldiers, using techniques that suggest bloodline heritage connecting you to individuals specifically trained to counter such enemies. Your qualifications are considerably more impressive than you seem to realize. And if investigation reveals that my heritage doesn't support such connections, if my fighting abilities represent unusual circumstances rather than bloodline capabilities, then we will address that situation when evidence supports such conclusion. But based on what I observed this morning, I'm confident that investigation will reveal connections to House Silvermane that explain both your capabilities and the circumstances surrounding your upbringing. The conviction in his voice suggested knowledge beyond what had been shared openly, though Alara recognized she lacked sufficient information to evaluate what additional intelligence might inform his certainty about conclusions that seemed to her based on limited evidence. But as she prepared to respond to his offer, new sounds reached them through the afternoon air. Horn calls that spoke of urgent messages requiring immediate attention, ground vibrations that suggested multiple forces moving at speed, and beneath it all, the distant screams that meant settlements were already under attack. "Sire," Captain Fenris called from his position with the mounted scouts. "Reports confirm coordinated assault on multiple settlements beginning immediately. Thornhaven is under direct attack by forces that include creatures previously unknown to our intelligence regarding shadow spawn capabilities. Mobilize for immediate response," King Ragnar commanded, his attention immediately shifting to tactical concerns that would determine whether thousands lived or died, based on decisions made within minutes rather than hours. But as the Lycan war host prepared for combat operations that would test their legendary capabilities against enemies whose power remained unknown, the king's attention returned briefly to Alara, with intensity that made clear her decision couldn't wait for more comfortable timing. "Lady Nightwind," he said with formality that acknowledged the magnitude of choice she faced. "Circumstances require immediate decision about accepting my protection and commission, or returning to human forces whose survival prospects against enhanced shadow spawn capabilities appear limited based on morning's evidence." The choice was between safety under protection she couldn't fully trust and danger among people she understood, but who might no longer be capable of accepting what she was becoming. Between investigating heritage that might explain capabilities she couldn't control, and maintaining comfortable lives that no longer seemed adequate for survival in a world where supernatural threats demanded supernatural responses. Looking at King Ragnar's expectant expression, then toward Thornhaven where smoke was beginning to rise above buildings that housed people she had sworn to protect, Alara made decision that would determine whether her story continued as human soldier or began anew as something she didn't yet understand but could no longer deny. "Your Majesty," she said with clarity that surprised her despite exhaustion that made thinking difficult, "I accept your commission and protection, with understanding that my primary obligation remains protecting innocent lives, regardless of political complications that may arise from heritage investigation." "Understood and accepted," King Ragnar replied with satisfaction that suggested her answer had been both hoped for and expected. "Welcome to Lycan Military Service Specialist Nightwind. Your first assignment is accompanying our assault force to defend Thornhaven against enemies whose capabilities you have encountered more recently than any of my soldiers." As she prepared to mount the spare horse that was quickly provided by soldiers whose efficiency spoke of extensive experience with rapid military adaptation to changing circumstances, Alara realized that her previous life had ended not with her death on this morning's battlefield, but with survival that had revealed capabilities she couldn't explain, and heritage she couldn't ignore. Whatever she discovered about her true background, whatever political complications emerged from investigation of bloodline connections that should have been impossible, the woman who had fought alone against supernatural enemies, while human military forces fled, was gone forever. The person preparing to ride with Lycan forces toward combat that would determine her people's survival was someone whose identity remained to be determined, but whose loyalty to protecting innocence remained unchanged, regardless of what revelations about supernatural heritage might reshape her understanding of her own nature and capabilities. The Lycan king and his army saw me battling alone, and they were shocked. Chapter 3. The ride toward Thornhaven revealed capabilities Alara had never suspected she possessed, abilities that became apparent only when supernatural necessity demanded their manifestation. The horse provided by King Ragnar's forces was clearly bred for Lycan riders, its supernatural endurance and intelligence requiring communication methods that transcended conventional horsemanship. Yet somehow she found herself coordinating with the creature as if they had trained together for years, understanding its responses and intentions through awareness that bypassed conscious thought. More unsettling was her ability to match the pace maintained by riders whose supernatural nature allowed them to cover distances that would have killed normal mounts. The war host moved with fluid coordination that spoke of pack mentality extending to their mounted formation, each rider positioned to support collective movement that prioritized speed and tactical flexibility over individual comfort or conventional military organization. Alara found herself naturally integrating into their formation, despite lacking formal training in Lycan military tactics. Her position shifted automatically to maintain optimal spacing with surrounding riders, while her awareness extended to encompass the entire unit's movement patterns with clarity that felt both natural and impossible. "Specialist Nightwind," King Ragnar said during brief pause when the war hosts stopped to water their mounts at stream that marked halfway point toward their destination. "Your adaptation to Lycan military formation has been remarkably swift for someone without previous experience in supernatural unit coordination. Your Majesty, I find myself responding to patterns I don't consciously understand but somehow recognize," she replied honestly, uncertain whether such admission represented confession of inadequacy or acknowledgement of capabilities that continued to manifest without explanation. "The coordination feels familiar, despite being unlike anything I was taught during conventional military training. Captain Fenris," the king said to his second in command, "your assessment of Specialist Nightwind's integration with unit movement patterns?" "Sire, her positioning and response timing indicate pack sense awareness at levels that typically require months of formal training with acknowledged Lycan units," came the reply in the rough voice that Alara had begun to associate with supernatural beings maintaining human forms through conscious effort. Her adaptation suggests either extraordinary natural ability or bloodline heritage that includes genetic memory of pack coordination techniques. "And your conclusion regarding which explanation seems more likely?" "Bloodline heritage, Your Majesty. Natural ability alone doesn't account for the specific movement patterns she's displaying, which correspond to advanced techniques developed by House Silvermane for integration with mixed units that included both Lycan and enhanced human elements. The revelation that her instinctive responses matched historical techniques developed by the noble house that King Ragnar suspected represented her true heritage provided additional evidence supporting theories about her background that grew more compelling with each supernatural capability she unconsciously displayed. But analysis of heritage implications was interrupted by scout reports that demanded immediate tactical attention. "Sire," called one of the ranging scouts whose responsibilities included advance reconnaissance of threatened areas. "Thornhaven is under coordinated assault by shadow spawn forces that include creatures previously unknown to our intelligence networks. The garrison is holding defensive positions but barely, and civilian evacuation is proceeding too slowly to prevent significant casualties if current tactical situation continues. Assessment of enemy capabilities? Enhanced strength and coordination beyond previous shadow spawn encounters, plus several large creatures that appear immune to conventional weapons. Human forces are taking heavy casualties despite defensive advantages provided by prepared positions and familiar terrain. Estimated timeline for garrison collapse if current trends continue? Hours rather than days, Your Majesty. The enhanced shadow spawn are systematically destroying defensive positions that should have held against normal assault forces, while the large creatures are creating breaches that allow smaller enemies to penetrate areas that were previously secure. Liso, King Ragnar's expression darkened as tactical assessments painted picture of crisis that threatened not just military defeat, but civilian massacre on scale that would destabilize the entire border region. Thornhaven's fall would encourage additional shadow spawn incursions while demonstrating human inability to defend against enhanced enemies, potentially triggering mass panic and refugee crises that would strain resources across multiple territories. Mobilize for immediate assault operations, he commanded with authority that transformed casual conversation into focused military coordination. Priority objectives are relieving pressure on human defensive positions and identifying tactical intelligence regarding enhanced shadow spawn capabilities that will inform broader defensive strategies. As the war host prepared for combat operations that would test their legendary effectiveness against enemies whose true capabilities remained unknown, Alara found herself assigned to advance reconnaissance duties that placed her at the forefront of engagement planning despite her complete lack of experience with Lycan military tactics. "Specialist Nightwind," King Ragnar said as they prepared to resume their approach toward Thornhaven. "Your recent encounter with enhanced shadow spawn forces provides intelligence that no other member of this unit possesses. During initial engagement, your observations regarding enemy capabilities and weaknesses will be crucial for developing effective assault strategies. Your Majesty, I'm honored by such responsibility, but I should emphasize that my previous encounter occurred under circumstances where survival took precedence over systematic tactical analysis. My observations may be incomplete or influenced by factors that don't apply to large unit operations. Understood. Nevertheless, experience with enemies that have defeated experienced human forces while you survived represents intelligence baseline that exceeds anything my soldiers can provide based on theoretical analysis alone. The weight of responsibility for providing tactical intelligence that would influence combat operations potentially affecting thousands of lives was daunting enough under normal circumstances. But approaching battle while simultaneously struggling to understand capabilities that suggested supernatural heritage she had never suspected added layers of pressure that threatened to overwhelm rational analysis. But as they crested the final hill that provided visual confirmation of Thornhaven's situation, personal concerns became irrelevant compared to immediate crisis that demanded action, regardless of individual preparation or comfort levels. The settlement spread below them painted picture of desperate defense against enemies that clearly possessed capabilities far beyond normal shadow spawn limitations. Smoke rose from multiple buildings that had been set ablaze by creatures whose fire-breathing abilities had never been reported in previous intelligence assessments. The defensive walls that should have provided security against conventional assault showed breaches that spoke of physical strength, sufficient to demolish stone fortifications through direct force. Most disturbing were the creatures visible moving among the attacking forces, beings whose size and apparent coordination suggested evolutionary development beyond anything recorded in existing knowledge about shadow spawn capabilities. Some moved on multiple limbs with speed that made them difficult to track visually, while others seemed to phase between solid and shadow states that allowed them to bypass defensive obstacles entirely. "Captain Fenris," King Ragnar said quietly, his tone suggesting controlled alarm at witnessing capabilities that challenged assumptions about enemy limitations. "Preliminary assessment of enhanced shadow spawn tactical advantages. Sire, the creatures display coordination and specialized capabilities that suggest central command authority rather than instinctive pack behavior. The variety of enhanced abilities indicates selective breeding or magical enhancement designed to counter specific defensive strategies employed by human military forces. Implications for engagement strategies developed for normal shadow spawn encounters. Existing tactics will require significant modification to address enhanced speed, coordination, and apparent immunity to conventional weapons displayed by several creature types. Recommend immediate adaptation of assault plans to incorporate capabilities demonstrated by Specialist Nightwin, whose proven effectiveness against enhanced enemies represents tactical advantage that standard approaches lack." Alara felt renewed pressure as she realized that her mysterious fighting abilities, whatever their source, were being incorporated into military planning that would determine whether desperate defenders below lived or died, based on decisions made within minutes rather than hours. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, recognizing that modesty about her capabilities could contribute to tactical failures that cost innocent lives, "I should clarify that my effectiveness against enhanced shadow spawn appears to depend on circumstances I don't fully understand or control. I cannot guarantee that previous results can be replicated in different combat situations. Your honesty regarding capability limitations is noted and appreciated," King Ragnar replied, with tone that suggested her caution enhanced rather than diminished his confidence in her assessments. "But Specialist Nightwin, proven effectiveness under desperate circumstances, often provides better intelligence baseline than theoretical analysis based on conventional assumptions. How would you recommend incorporating my capabilities into assault planning given uncertainty about their reliability? By placing you in position where your unique effectiveness can be utilized if circumstances permit, while ensuring that primary tactical success doesn't depend entirely on capabilities that remain partially unknown. You'll accompany advance assault elements responsible for creating breaches in enemy coordination, but backup strategies will assume normal human limitations if supernatural advantages fail to manifest." The compromise approach balanced practical utilization of her demonstrated capabilities with recognition that depending too heavily on abilities she couldn't reliably control represented dangerous tactical planning that could result in catastrophic failure if her mysterious advantages proved situational rather than consistent. As the war host began final approach toward Thornhaven, moving with coordination that transformed individual riders into components of unified assault force whose effectiveness had become legendary throughout supernatural military conflicts, Alara found herself positioned near the front of formation, where her capabilities could be utilized immediately if circumstances demanded supernatural intervention. But her attention was suddenly captured by sound that cut through ambient noise of approaching battle with clarity that suggested supernatural enhancement of her auditory perception. From within Thornhaven's defensive perimeter came cry that she recognized with shock that sent ice through her exhausted frame. "Marcus," she called out, before thinking about protocol regarding communication during tactical approaches. "Captain Marcus is still alive." King Ragnar's attention immediately focused on her with intensity that suggested her reaction provided intelligence that affected operational planning. "You recognize specific individuals among the defenders?" "Yes, Your Majesty. Captain Marcus commanded the scouting force that encountered enhanced shadow spawn this morning." His voice suggests he's coordinating defensive efforts from position near the eastern gate, which means human command structure may still be functional despite heavy casualties. Intelligence regarding functional command structure affects coordination possibilities between our assault force and existing defenders, Captain Fenris observed with tone that suggested tactical significance beyond personal concern for individual survival. If human defenders retain organized leadership, synchronized assault becomes feasible rather than requiring independent operations that might interfere with each other. "Establish communication with human defensive leadership," King Ragnar commanded, his decision-making reflecting integration of intelligence that Alara's supernatural hearing had provided. "Coordinate assault timing to maximize effectiveness of combined operations." But as they prepared to descend toward battle, that would test both Lycan capabilities and her own mysterious abilities against enemies whose enhanced powers remained partially unknown, new complication emerged that transformed tactical challenge into something approaching nightmare scenario. Through the smoke and chaos of ongoing battle came creatures whose appearance defied every assumption about shadow spawn limitations. These beings moved with intelligence that spoke of strategic thinking rather than instinctive hunting, their coordination suggesting not just pack behavior, but military organization capable of adapting tactics based on defensive responses they encountered. More terrifying still was their apparent immunity to weapons that should have been effective against supernatural enemies. Alara watched human defenders strike creatures with blessed steel that had proven effective against normal shadow spawn, only to see their weapons pass harmlessly through shadow substance that reformed immediately around ineffective attacks. "Captain Fenris," King Ragnar said with tone that struggled to maintain calm authority while processing evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about supernatural warfare. "Analysis of enhanced shadow spawn defensive capabilities? Unknown, sire. The immunity to blessed steel suggests magical enhancement beyond anything recorded in our intelligence regarding shadow spawn evolution. If similar immunity extends to our weapons, standard assault tactics may prove ineffective regardless of coordination advantages. Recommendations for engagement modification? Unknown, Your Majesty. We lack information regarding what weapons or techniques might prove effective against enemies that appear immune to conventional supernatural warfare methods." The admission that Lycan military leadership, despite centuries of successful supernatural warfare experience, lacked tactical knowledge necessary for addressing enhanced enemies created crisis of confidence that threatened to paralyze decision-making, precisely when decisive action was most crucial. But Alara, studying the enhanced creatures with attention that drew upon mysterious awareness capabilities she had demonstrated throughout the day, began to recognize patterns that suggested possible vulnerabilities, despite their apparent immunity to conventional weapons. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, uncertain whether her observations represented actual intelligence or desperate hope seeking foundation in insufficient evidence. "The enhanced creatures appear to maintain immunity to conventional weapons through constant expenditure of magical energy that must be sustained through concentration or external power sources. Their defensive capabilities may be vulnerable to disruption if that concentration can be broken or those power sources interrupted. Basis for such assessment? Observation of movement patterns that suggest the creatures must maintain deliberate focus to sustain their immunity, combined with tactical positioning that keeps them in contact with larger creatures that might represent power sources for magical enhancement they display." King Ragnar studied her face with intensity that suggested he was evaluating not just her tactical assessment, but her capability for providing reliable intelligence under combat stress. Behind him, Captain Fenris showed similar attention to analysis that could determine whether their assault had any hope of success, or would merely add Lycan casualties to human losses, already mounting from ineffective conventional tactics. Captain Fenris, assessment of Specialist Nightwind's tactical analysis. Theoretical plausibility, sire, though verification would require engagement that risks significant casualties if assessment proves incorrect. However, current tactical situation offers limited alternatives given apparent ineffectiveness of conventional approaches, and recommended engagement strategy based on theoretical vulnerabilities identified. Coordinated assault targeting suspected power sources, while simultaneously testing immunity limitations through varied attack methods. High-risk approach, but potentially our only option for achieving tactical success, rather than merely adding to casualty statistics. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.